an insect lands on your arm right now, you wipe it away, or you crush it, you feel absolutely nothing. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors survived by taking life with that exact same cold logic. Today, the story you tell yourself is the same. These bugs are just flesh gears. They are blind wiring. They are a speck of living meat running on automatic pilot with nobody home behind the eyes. The whole world buys into this. Science bought into it for a solid century. Something broke in the last few years. The people cutting open these minds for a living are quietly backing away from their old textbooks. Admitting they were wrong would have ended a career a decade ago. Now, they are whispering it. The lights are actually on. Down inside that speck of living meat, there is a witness. There's someone who looks out. Someone who desires things. Someone who sees your hand coming down and desperately wants to live. This is a weird question. The answer feels easy. It is not. Modern biology is terrified of this question. The deeper they dig, the darker the truth gets. By the end of this story, we are standing in front of a very specific test. A dish of sweet water sits on scorching metal. What one single bee decides to do at that burning dish is going to ruin the way you view the world. The next time you raise your hand for a blind strike, you will freeze. Hold on to that image. We will return to the fire. Because before you see the fire, you have to look into the eyes of one honeybee. Look at her skull. The brain inside is smaller than a single grain of dust. It runs on less than 1 million connections. Your skull holds 86 billion. That gap is massive. It is the difference between a silent dirt road and a roaring continent. Yet in 2018, a researcher named Scarlett Howard at RMIT University in Melbourne dropped a study in the journal Science that shattered the floor. She trained honeybees to land on the paper card holding the fewest shapes. Then she gave them a card holding absolutely nothing. The bees flew straight to the blank paper. They understood that nothing actually counts. They understood that zero anchors the bottom of the math. That is not blind wiring. That is grasping the void. It puts the bee in the top tier of minds, right next to dolphins, monkeys, and human children. Think about your own bloodline. 300,000 years ago, your stone-sharpening ancestors spent millennia just trying to invent the concept of nothing. A bee grasped the void in a single afternoon. Discoveries like that forced the scientific world to break its own rules. Back in 2012, top neuroscientists signed the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. They finally agreed humans do not hold a monopoly on the biological spark. People read that news and pictured dogs. They pictured dolphins. Nobody pictured a bee. Then came April 19th, 2024. Over 80 scientists and philosophers signed the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. They wrote one sentence that should have stopped the world. The evidence points to a realistic possibility of conscious experience in many invertebrates. They pointed straight at crabs, octopuses, and insects. Read the ink on that paper again. The global scientific establishment now officially admits it. A bee realistically experiences the physical world. What did they actually find? Start with the eyes. Not her eyes. Yours. In 2005, that exact same Melbourne lab pulled off a trick. They forced bees to look at human faces. Photographs were pinned to a blank wall. A sweet rush of sugar rewarded a landing on one specific human. Out in the wild, bees have zero reason to track human faces. We are just moving weather to them. Yet they learned the lines of our faces. Even when the scientists removed the sugar, the bees kept hitting the correct human. 90% of the time. 2 days later, the memory held strong. Sit with that. A creature possessing a mind smaller than a water drop stared at a human face, decided it mattered, and carried that image for days. Right now, a bee outside might know exactly what you look like. Holding a memory is cold data. Feeling a mood is a biological hunger. This is where the meat machine theory falls apart. In a long chain of tests, capped by Lars Chitka's team in London, bees broke the robot rules. Drop a surprise hit of sugar on a bee before a test. She feels a rush of hope. Placed in a gray zone of uncertain choices, she dives in faster. She commits. The fuel for this is dopamine. When you drank your coffee this morning to chase a chemical spark, you fired up the exact same survival pathway your ancestors used to endure the Ice Age. Frighten the bee instead. Stage a fake spider attack. A shadow of dread takes over. She slows down. She doubts everything. The exact same physical world is suddenly viewed through a much darker lens. All of this is happening inside the exact same tiny mind. Then you watch the footage. Tiny wooden spheres sit near a nest. The bees roll them. No sugar exists near the spheres. No physical reward is offered. They push the spheres anyway. They leave their daily path entirely just to roll these wooden objects around. The young bees push the hardest. They act exactly the way a young dog acts on the grass. You cannot frame this as just keeping the blood pumping. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors sat around fires throwing rocks in the air, not to fill their stomachs, but to feed a biological hunger of the mind. They just play. It spreads past the bees. A male fruit fly is rejected by a female. He immediately hunts for alcohol. Other flies are forced into a box with dead bodies. The sight changes them so violently that they age faster and die earlier. Today, modern men drown themselves in alcohol when love shatters. It is the exact same chemical crash. Return to the bee. Her terror opens a dark door. Teach a bee to fear a hidden killer on a specific flower. Remove the killer. She will still freeze on perfectly safe petals. She will scan the empty space. She sees a killer that does not exist. She is chasing ghosts. To carry the heavy weight of a ghost, you need a mind capable of holding on to the past. A bumblebee knows the exact boundaries of her own body. Flown at walls with different gaps, large bees reject the tight spaces that smaller bees fly straight through. When a gap sits directly on the edge of possible, a bee turns her body sideways. She manages a tight squeeze to protect her wings. Just like you instantly know you cannot slip through a narrow door without even trying it. To pull that off, an animal must carry a physical map of where her meat ends and the world begins. Other insects draw that line between me and not me even harder. Pinned under heavy rubble, a trapped ant triggers a rescue from her peers. The rescuers dig only above the buried parts. They pull gently at her legs. They bite through the exact dirt holding her down. A rescuer doing this must tell her own legs apart from the trapped legs. She knows what is me and what is not me. Bees push this boundary further. Handed puzzles of different levels. Bees simply walk away from the brutal ones. They quit. By walking away, they bump up their own win rate. This is an animal sensing the edge of knowing. They do not just know the answer. They know whether they know it. In 2016, two scientists named Andrew Barron and Colin Klein tied this all together. The tiny knot of tissue at the center of a bug's head runs the exact same job as the midbrain inside you. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors relied entirely on this primal spark to feel raw existence. It is far older than your outer thinking shell. Strip a human brain down to that bare pulse, and someone is still in there. The terrifying thought is this: a bee never had anything else, and it might be enough. Now we bring this back to the dish of sweet water. In 2022, a researcher named Matilda Gibbons, operating inside Lars Chitka's lab, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The setup was coldly exact. Bumblebees received feeders full of sweet water. Scientists heated specific feeders to 55 degrees. Scorching metal, hot enough to physically burn. A specific color marked each feeder. When the cool feeders held thick sugar, the bees avoided the heat completely. That is a basic reflex. Then the scientists emptied the safe feeders. The bees immediately landed on the scorching metal. They chose the burn to get a better meal. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors shoved bare hands into sharp thorns to grab berries. They stepped dangerously close to open fires to pull out cooked meat. They calculated an algebra of pain. They traded physical damage for survival. The bee executed that exact same math. Suffering sits on one side. Reward sits on the other. They made a clear choice, because they used the painted colors to decide that math happened deep inside the brain. It was not a blind twitch of a leg. Trading pain for a reward is the ultimate test. Scientists use it to separate raw damage from a creature truly feeling the fire. We accept this exact evidence for animals we protect. It spreads beyond the bees. Damage a single nerve in a fruit fly. The fly collapses into an endless loop of hurt. It recoils from objects that never used to cause damage. Here is the nightmare you cannot shake. Think about the last fly you killed. Think about the mosquito you wiped away against your arm. A massive scientific argument now stands right behind that strike. In that final half second, something inside that shell saw the shadow falling. It knew exactly what was coming. It desperately wanted to live. Honesty demands a hard turn right here. The strongest pushback against this idea is brutal. Take that dark mood that looks exactly like despair. Scientists can force that exact same behavior out of a rat with a severed spine. They can trigger it in a headless cockroach. A severed head feels no misery. A behavior mimicking pain proves absolutely nothing on its own. Critics push this even harder. You can build a robot to recoil. You can program dead wires to hesitate. You can code a machine to calculate costs with zero feeling inside it. Maybe a bee is exactly that. A beautiful meat machine faking a pulse. The scientists fire back. Evolution refuses to burn precious energy-building creatures that just fake their pain. A chemical antidepressant does not fix a broken machine, but they freely admit the final truth. We lack absolute proof of consciousness in a bug. We also lack absolute proof of consciousness in the human sitting right next to you. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors only saw a soul inside their own tribe. They looked at strangers and saw wild animals. You execute the exact same logic today. You trust the person beside you has a voice in the dark simply because their face matches yours. You watch them pull a bare hand back from the fire. You watch them chase the sweet and run from the burn. You never actually see their mind. You just blindly believe it because they act exactly like you. You run that exact same judgment on that exact same physical evidence. Then you strictly refuse to apply it to the bee. The bee pulls her hand back from the fire too. The line you draw between a human and a bug is not built on facts. It is built entirely on size. It is built on how alien the face looks. It is built on how incredibly easy it is to just look away. Pull the lens back. This is not just one bee in a room. Right now, 10 quintillion insects breathe on this planet. That is a 1 trailing 19 zeros. A billion bugs walk the dirt for every single human. The crushing weight of their bodies is 70 times heavier than all of humanity stacked together. We write laws to protect anything with a spine. Bugs face zero rules of mercy. They face it in the wild. They face it in the test tubes. They face it in massive factories breeding them by the trillions for our food. If the ink on that New York Declaration is even slightly true, our reality flips. We share this dirt with the largest ocean of feeling beings to ever exist. 300,000 years ago, your ancestors walked past them without a second thought. You do the exact same thing today. Bugs hunted on this rock hundreds of millions of years before a human took a breath. We never stopped to ask what they felt. We inherited a blinding arrogance. We assumed the dark was empty. We assumed a shell that small could never hold a soul. We were wrong. A bee grasps the total void of zero. A bee studies your face and carries that image to the grave. A bee does the brutal algebra of pain and chooses to burn. 10 quintillion tiny heads are moving out there right now. That is 10 quintillion windows of meat and light. Each window cracks open for just a few days. Every single one is fighting blindly just to stay alive. We told a comforting lie. We told ourselves we were the only minds truly awake in the dark. We were just too massive and too arrogant to look down at our own feet. So stop. The next time a bug lands on your skin and your hand raises up to strike, Remember the fire. Remember the science backing away from the machine. You're not crushing dead wiring. You're looking at a witness, and they saw you first,